It is such a good thing to gather together as the church. And one of the things I've loved over the past few weeks, and in fact the last month, is tracking with the series Live by Love, when it's been about reframing who we are as followers of Jesus and the church as one together around simply what it means to love God and love people. Has anyone else loved the simplicity of that? Do we think about what it means to follow Jesus? Easy. We're going to love God with every part of who we are, and we're going to grow towards loving people as God loves us. How good is that? That's what it means to be the church. If anyone asks you, what's the whole deal with Christianity? There's a simple phrase. Hey, it's all about learning to grow to love God more and more, and learning to grow to love others more and more. There we go. We got it. And I've loved that series, been really encouraged by that. And this morning I want to do something new flowing off the back of that. And as a starting point, I was reminded this week of an awesome story in the history of the royal family. Any fans of the royal family? Come on, some old school Brits in the building. You're still repping it. And there's a great story from King George VI. And some of you might remember it either if you're, royal family history buffs or if you've seen the film The King's Speech. And it tells the story of King George VI, who suffered from quite a severe speech impediment. And part of his role as king, of course, was to make public addresses, to deliver speeches, to really rally the nation of England around who he was as a royal and a monarch. And he had an incredible difficulty doing that. And the story and the movie in particular, great movie if you haven't seen it incidentally, and I'm not normally a fan of historical dramas, so that's saying something, but a great movie. And it tells the story of his initial struggles with communicating, with speaking, with his speech, and then enlists the help of a famous speech pathologist that kind of coaches him and gets him to the point where he can deliver this powerful public address and add that to who he was as a king and in his role in the royal family. And it powerfully illustrates the importance and the value of something that every single day, I think myself and each one of us, we undervalue, and that's our voice. And that's the way that we're speaking. And it's the quality of our speech and the kinds of words and phrases that come out of who we are as people. Because kind of once you've learned to talk right, you kind of take it for granted. Anyone remember when you've got kids and they're learning to talk? Anyone remember that? Come on, there's some young parents here. It wasn't that long ago. Thank you. I know I'm not the only one who's ever had kids. And when your kids learn to speak, it's this incredible thing. They start saying words and you're just like, whoa, you can talk now. That's crazy. I heard someone once describe having kids as like having a puppy that slowly learns how to talk. I thought that was a little bit disrespectful and not my view of kids, but that was one way it was explained to me. And anyway, but then once you've learned to speak, we kind of forget about it. We've got that skill. Words come out of our mouths, and we live our lives, and we go and we go and we go. But what I want to speak into today, and here's the title for my message that's already there with us: your talk is your walk. Can someone say that for me on the count of three? 1, 2, 3. Your talk is your walk. And it flows from this idea that the way that we speak about ourselves, the way that we speak to other people, the way that we speak about the situations that we face will actually have a powerful formative effect on how we live our lives. Does that ring true for anyone here this morning? You've sensed that in your own life. You perhaps, maybe what our brains go to first is you see it in the lives of other people, right? Because everyone else hasn't got this worked out, but I do. Anyone else thinking that this morning? We need to listen more than anyone else probably. But I want to take you to an interesting story in the Old Testament to help lean into this idea. And I want to take you to a part of God's story through the Old Testament where Israel, which is the central kind of people, God's people in the Old Testament, they've been led for a period of history by spiritual leaders called the Judges. And that began with Joshua, and it goes all the way through to the prophet Samuel. And that's where we're going to pick up today, where Israel, all of a sudden, they look to the other nations around the place and they say, God, those people have got a king. Those people over there, they've got a king to protect them, to look after them, to lead them into battle. And Israel says to God, God, we want a king too. And God's like, rude, you have a king, it's me. But nonetheless, God says, okay, you can have a king. Here's going to be some of the realities about what it means to have a king. And in 1 Samuel, we hear the story of how Israel comes to be run by a king, and his name is Saul. And I want to take you to the very first chapter of Saul's narrative within the Old Testament, because there's something really powerful here when we consider what it means to consider how our talk is shaping our walk. Can I take you to the first verse of chapter 9? Anyone got a Bible here this morning? Just Musa. I love it. You're welcome. So here we go. Chapter 9, verse 1 and 2. We got it up on the big screen, or the big screens, should I say. There was a Benjamite, one of the 12 tribes of Israel, a man of standing. In other translations, they call this a mighty man of power, or a man of wealth, a man of influence, whose name was Kish, son of Abiel, the son of Zerah, the son of Bechorath, the son of Aphia of Benjamin. And the reason we get that little account of his genealogy is that for ancient Israel, who your dad was mattered. Your family mattered. It was a source of, agency. It was a source of influence, a source of respect, amongst others, is that your family line was actually significant. And we know that Saul here is coming from a man of influence named Kish. Now, Kish, verse 2, he had a son named Saul, as handsome, look out, a young man as could be found anywhere in Israel. Whoa, this is quite a glowing introduction. It's like this guy, he was more attractive than anyone else in all of Israel. In another translation, it says he was more impressive than any young man in all of Israel. You kind of get a picture of this guy. If they had Instagram back then, he would have just been blowing up everywhere. He was attractive. He was a looker. And to top it off, he was a head taller than anyone else. So you can't imagine the most attractive man in Israel. He's also 7 foot, just this incredible, imposing, just awesome figure. He comes from this incredible family. They're rich, they're influential, they're powerful. And so what we see is the author of 1 Samuel here. He is just giving a glowing review of who Saul is. He's amazing. He's more impressive than any of the other young men. On top of that, he's a head taller than everyone else. It's almost like literally, figuratively, this guy's a head taller than everyone else in Israel. He is amazing. So we see a description of Saul that's very empowering. Who would agree with that? It's like, yeah, this is a description of a guy that sounds amazing. And the author gives an account of Saul that is probably pretty similar to what other people would have said about him. This guy's amazing. His dad's Kish. They're like, they've got it all worked out. They're rich, they're powerful. And if you see how big he is, he's 7 feet tall. It's amazing. That's the kind of way people would have spoken about him. Now, what we're going to see is there's a difference between this empowering language that the author speaks about Saul, that others would have spoken about him, and how Saul himself speaks. I want to take you to this story, and just quickly before we do, I'll give you a little bit of a background. So the story of Saul begins with his father, Kish, this mighty man, this man of standing, saying, Saul, I've lost my donkeys. Can you go and find them? Take a servant, go and find my donkeys. Anyone lost a dog before? It's a fun experience, right? Actually, can I pause just for a moment? So our youth pastor, John, who likes John? John's amazing. I absolutely love John. He's a phenomenal pastor, awesome guy. But I'm going to tell a funny story as well. So he used to live on my street, right? We lived on the same street, and it was a loop. And I remember one afternoon I was shooting some hoops out the front. We had a little basketball court on our driveway. And I noticed that John's dog just sprinted past the road, just like full sending it, running up this street. And you know when dogs are like running and panting, it kind of looks like they're laughing? Has anyone experienced that before? You know the dog that's just like, you know it's doing something really naughty, and it knows it's doing something really naughty. Any dog owners experienced that? Aren't they fun? You're just like, let's take this thing to the pound and be done with it. No, it is a forever pet. It's a forever pet. You don't take it to the pound. And I see this dog sprinting with its laugh. I immediately recognize it as John's dog. And then sure enough, about 30 seconds later, I see John running behind him. Literally the angriest I've ever seen him in my life. Normally he's an incredibly positive dude. And he ran past, and I just lost it laughing. I just thought this was the funniest thing. And then I just kept shooting hoops because, I'm selfish and didn't want to help. And a little while later, I saw him come back, and he's just dejected. His head's down. He's walking past. He knows I'm there. He knows I'm laughing. And he's like, Phil, I've had it. That's it. I've just had enough. He can go to the pound. I don't care what happens to him anymore. And he processed those feelings and went back and found his dog and took them home eventually because he's a man of character. But this moment for me was so funny. And for anyone that's lost a dog, this is kind of what Saul's facing. The donkeys, they've run away. Saul, you got to go find these donkeys. And it ends up being quite an ordeal, just like what John experienced that fateful afternoon. And Saul travels from one place looking for the donkeys. He can't find them. He travels to the next place looking for these donkeys. He's getting a little bit more upset. He can't find them. Travels to the third place looking for these donkeys, gets a little bit more upset. And finally, he gets to that moment where he's had enough. Now, I want you to listen to what Saul says here in verse 5. Now, when they reached the district of Zuph, Saul said to the servant who was with him, "Come, let's go back." Pause your reading right there. Stop reading. Stop it. You're still reading. He says, "Let's go back." Now, for Saul, this was the moment where he's like, okay, I've had enough. These donkeys, I don't know where they are, but we're going home. We're giving up on the task that we've been given. That's essentially what he's communicating. And then, following off, for those that were faithful to me requesting that you stop reading, we'll go there now. Or my father will stop thinking about the donkeys and start thinking about us. So here's what Saul's doing right here in this moment. He's saying, it's time to give up. This is too hard. Now, here's my excuse. And he's a master of making it a noble excuse. He says, if we don't go back now, my dad's going to start worrying about where we are. It comes across as quite noble, doesn't it? Like, my dad's going to worry. We've got to go back and give up. Now, this is a talk-shaping walk moment in the life of Saul. And here's the talk-shaping walk moment. And I think we'll have it up on the screen. This is too hard. Anyone felt that before? Yep. Anyone said a variation of that before? Yeah, oh, you don't have to put your hands up, but I was just kind of, but please do. I love the engagement. So this is a talk-shaping walk moment where Saul says, this is too hard. And he offers a noble excuse to get away with the decision that he's made. He's going to be feeling terrible about me not being home, so we better go home. Or was it the task has become really difficult and annoying, and it's just too hard? Here's a noble excuse to get myself off the hook. You know, sometimes that's the kind of language that, if I'm honest, comes out of who I am when I'm faced with challenging situations. And when that talk starts to come out of who we are, it's going to influence the way that we walk. It's going to influence the way that we talk to others, the way that we confront the problems that we face. And for Saul, we see it showing up here in almost his first dialogue in the whole arc of his narrative through Samuel. This is too hard. Not an encouraging start for the man who would be king. Then in verse 7, we get to the point where his servant, who incidentally seems like quite a positive guy, he's like, we get this done, we're doing this. He says, nearby there's a prophet who was Samuel. And perhaps if we go to the prophet will be able to tell us where our donkeys are. So he's thinking solution side. He's like, no, let's not give up. We can do this. And then here's how Saul responds to that. Here's how Saul responds in verse 7. He said to his servant, if we go, what can we give the man? Because the custom was that when you went to see the prophet, you'd bring some kind of an offering. The food in our sacks is gone. We've got no gift to take the man of God. What do we have? And again, Saul meets the obstacle in front of him with this kind of language that makes him less than what he is. He says, we don't have enough. And this is talk shaping walk moment number 2 in the life of Saul. We don't have enough. He starts with, this is too hard, time to give up, time to go home. And now he says, we don't have what we need. We don't have the resources. We don't have enough to do this. I won't ask you to put your hands up, but maybe in a moment of reflection, we can say, yeah, there's been times where for me, I've said the same kind of things, whether it be in relation to a project at work, may it be in relating to who I am as a parent, who I am as a husband, or whatever arena of life it may be, where we say, we don't have enough to do this. And again, when we do that, we give ourselves an excuse. I had no chance. I didn't have what I needed. And this is how Saul continues to speak. Now, his servant is amazing. And his servant responds to this. He says, actually, I've got a little bit of silver. We can go to Samuel, and hopefully he can tell us where the donkeys are. Surely the prophet will be able to tell us. I'm thinking like, man, the servant needs to be the next king of Israel. He's positive. He's thinking of creative solutions. He's getting it done. And Saul, he kind of says, he's quite neutral in his tone here. He says, okay, let's go and see the prophet. And so they go on their way to see Samuel. Now, meanwhile, God has been speaking to Samuel about this whole idea of Israel wanting a king and who that king would be. And God reveals to Samuel that Saul, this guy out, of course, looking for donkeys currently, is going to be the new king. You're going to anoint him as the king of Israel. And so Saul, his servant, they meet Samuel, they have a few conversations, and then Samuel reveals what God is intending to do in Saul's life in making him the king. And here's how it plays out. Verse 20, as he begins this conversation with Samuel. As for the donkeys you lost 3 days ago, don't worry about them. They've been found. The whole donkey thing, that's sorted. It's been covered. They've found. They've gone home. Now, and to whom is all the desire of Israel turned, if not to you and your whole family line? Now, it's not immediately direct what Samuel's talking about here, but what he's referencing is the fact that as Israel's desire is to have a king, Samuel is revealing that that king is going to be Saul. He's saying all of Israel's desire for a king is centered on who you are. Now, this is the part of the story that some of you that have read chapter 9, this is probably the response you'll remember. Then in verse 21, Saul answered, "But am I not a Benjamite?" And in fact, something really cool to do here with this verse is remember verse 1 and how the author described Saul. Now, let's look at how Saul describes himself. "But am I not a Benjamite from the smallest tribe of Israel? And is not my clan the least of the clans of the tribe of Benjamin? Why do you say such a thing to me?" And here's the talk-shaping walk, moment number 3, where he says, "I am not enough." He begins saying, "This is too hard." He continues by saying, "We don't have enough." And now finally he gets to a point where he says, "I'm just not enough." If for him in his context, I can't be the king of Israel. My clan's the smallest. My tribe's the least. Funny that it's the complete opposite of how the author describes it. Your dad's a mighty man of power, influence, wealth. You're more impressive than any of the other young men in Israel. You're huge. Yet Saul thinks of himself as small. Now, the kingship of Saul doesn't end well. And later, God finds a king after his own heart, King David. For Saul, his kingship's cut short. And as I read the story, I see so much of it tracing back to this very first narrative and the kind of talk that comes out of Saul's mouth. It's just too hard. I don't have enough, and I'm not enough. So if we can kind of conclude together and perhaps agree together that our talk is going to influence the way that we walk, then if that's the case, what's shaping our talk? If our talk's going to have such a big impact on how we live our lives, how we relate to others, what's shaping my talk? You know, I want to show you something really quick as we reflect on this answer. Musa, would you mind bringing the whiteboard up? Who likes a good whiteboard? I've become more partial to the whiteboard over the last couple of years. The key, of course, is a good marker. I got a good marker. Any teachers here today? Anyone like a good whiteboard session? Or are you guys using, are you guys using fancier stuff now, like, smartboard. All right, we need to work on a smartboard. So I want to show you something here. We think about where does our talk come from? I want to share something with you called the communication process. Anyone ready to learn about how we communicate? And can we just agree to be forgiving of any spelling errors? I find it hard to do two things at once. All credit to our teachers who are rocking their smartboards and whiteboards and every other kind of board. So we're going to look at the communication process. Excuse me, thing. Musa? I'll go with Brian. Or you guys can just kind of scrum for it. I did favor to him, yeah. So the communication process. So what happens is, and I'm going to be someone communicating something on this side of the board here, that when I want to communicate, so actually first we need a side profile of my head here. Let's see how, well, that's a square forehead. And there you have it, Frankenstein, everybody. Yeah, if we can just kind of jazz that up. Yeah, no, but it's unrecoverable. But when we think about the communication process, it begins with an intended message. Did you like that little theatrical spin? I'm trying to jazz this up a little. So we begin with an intended message. So let's say that my intended message, and I'm going to speak to you together as a group, my intended message is, would you wave at me with your left hand? Hey, everyone. And most of you responded to that. So the intended message, would you wave at me with your left hand? Everyone following so far? Now, what actually happens within ourselves when we're communicating something and we have an intended message to give to another person, before it comes out of our mouth, it actually goes through a filter. This is all still happening in my giant head. And that filter we're going to call encoding. Someone say encoding? Encoding. So I have an intended message. And for the purposes of today, it was, would you wave at me with your left hand? Now, before that message comes out of my mouth, it goes through a process of encoding within my brain, where my personality will shape that intended message, where my experiences will shape that intended message, where my attitude will be added to that intended message, where my insecurities will be added to that intended message, where my ego will be added to that intended message. And the intended message can be encoded, or basically additional things added to, which can change how it comes across. So let's say in my intended message, would you wave your left hand? You don't have to do it again right now. We'll go somewhere with this. Let's say that that's my intended message, but it's got to go through a little bit of encoding within me. And let's say that I've got a whole bunch of ego. I'm not patient at all. I've got a low view of other people. Now that message is going to be shaped about all of those things that are true about who I am. And if that was the case, my message might come across something like this. Right now, put your left hand up and wave it. You're like, no. No, thank you. No, thank you, Mr. Ragey Pants. And it can change my intended message as it goes through the filter of who I am. Now, let's say on the flip side, let's say I'm really manipulating. And my intended message, I want people to wave their hand at me. And I say, I'm not going to like you at all unless you wave your left hand at me. You're like, no, thank you, Phil. You're in a bad way, my friend. And we're good at hearing it. Or maybe there's some encoding that goes on in me where I'm fearful or I'm insecure about who I am. And I'll say something like, hey guys, if it's not too much trouble, would you be willing to kind of just put your hand up in the air for a second? And what actually happened there was my insecurities actually caused me to communicate something that actually wasn't my intended message. Because I wanted you to wave your hand. Now I've just timidly said, how about you just put your hand up a little? And the intended messages that come out of us are encoded with all these different things that form who we are. Who's following so far? Okay, now there's another whole section to this. So it goes through that process of encoding. It comes out of me as good old-fashioned speech. How's my spelling errors so far? We tracking okay? For all the English people? I meant like English teachers and such, not English nationality. All right, I'm going to try to recover from this whole Frankenstein situation here. So let's just go with a nice smooth forehead. That was still pretty much the same, wasn't it? Is it slightly better? It's kind of, which of those two profiles would you prefer on your face? I think I'd slightly go with this guy. Now what happens? This person over here receives that message, but guess what? There's a filter before they can interpret it. And that we're going to call decoding. See where we're going here. And so it goes through the process of decoding to what will eventually be the interpreted message. So when I receive a message, I'm actually going to do some work decoding it in my mind as well, exactly as I would when I'm encoding. That there'll be things in me that will actually change how I hear a message. Let's think of this in what we've just read in chapter 9 in the life of Saul. Saul receives a few pieces of information. The first one we know about is, Saul, would you go and find my donkeys? Take a servant, go and find them. Now, what I conclude Saul kind of hears is, yeah, I'll do that until such a point as it gets too hard, and then I'll give up and come home. One thought about how Saul decodes that information. Next up, Saul's servant says, hey, let's go and see the prophet. And what was his talk-shaping moment? It was, we don't have enough. If we go to the prophet, we need to bring some kind of gift, but we don't have any kind of gift. We don't have enough. So when Saul hears his servant say, hey, let's go to the prophet, Saul decodes that in his mind with all the reasons that it can't be done. He says, we don't have enough, therefore we can't do it. And then lastly, Samuel says, Saul, all of Israel is turning its attention to you and your family. You're going to be anointed as our king. Saul decodes that message in his own mind through that lens of insecurity, through that idea of I am not enough. And he says, Samuel, you've got this wrong. I'm from Benjamin, the smallest of the tribes. My clan within is the smallest of all the clans. I can't do this. He decodes it in his mind as it goes through that internal filter. Now, we're going to put this away for a second because my weird foreheads are distracting. Now, one of the things I love about the New Testament, and particularly the life of Jesus, is that so often we see a principle like what I've just taken us through this morning that's shaped by modern-day psychology. And so often, Jesus, 2,000 years ago, is really ahead of the curve of what's going on in our own minds and hearts. And I want to take you to a passage of Scripture where Jesus talks about the filters that are present within who we are. Listen to this, and we're going to go to Matthew chapter 12, 34a through to 35. And here's what Jesus says, for the mouth speaks what the heart is full of. Now, when I hear that, I think about that process of encoding and decoding. There's messages we hear, there's messages that we give. And our speech will be colored by what our heart is full of. A good man brings good things out of the good stored up in him, and an evil man brings evil things out of the evil stored up in him. And here's how Jesus reflects on this same process. He says, out of who you are, your speech will be shaped. So there's perhaps some things that we could conclude about where Saul was at as a young man. Some things that showed up in who he was as a leader, and some things that caused him to ultimately fall short of who God invited him to be. As there was a continued trajectory of his language and his speech saying, I am less than who God sees me to be. Now, this shows up in my life as well. And there's a good chance it shows up in all of our lives as well. So what do we do about it? You know, a couple of years ago, we had an industrial dishwasher here at our Malu campus here at True North. You know the big industrial machines are and just get it done. And we had a whole bunch of different groups and people using this big industrial dishwasher. It was awesome. But one of the things would happen is as dinner plates were going through, as pots and pans were going through, all of that waste food, it's got to collect somewhere. And you know what I'm going with it. There's some knowing smiles here. And what happens with those big machines is there's a filter at the bottom. It's kind of like a little basket that all of the refuse collects in. I came to affectionately call it the filth basket within our kitchen. Because what would happen is if you neglected to empty that basket, a couple of things would start to happen. The first thing you'd notice is that when you do a load of dishes, they come out the other side. Normally they'd smell nice and clean and got that whole fresh kitchen clean smell. They'd come out and it'd be kind of like, why do these clean dishes smell like a combination of sauteed chicken and something else that I can't quite place? But overall, it just smells bad. And that's step one. Then step two is you walk through the building down here and you just smell something a little bit funky. What's that smell? And then when you're here as often as I am, you notice it straight away. You're like, oh, it's the filth basket. And then you wander in, and sure enough, that basket is just filled with rubbish. And it colors everything. Its smell goes everywhere. And the only thing to do about it is to empty it in a bin outside. Not in the kitchen bin. That doesn't solve the problem. It moves it slightly. Sorry, I'm just working through some pain from some previous seasons of ministry. And you empty it outside and you get rid of it. Now, when I think of the words of Jesus, that the mouth speaks what the heart's full of, one of the things that we need to become aware of is what our hearts are actually full of, and to clean out the filters of our soul. Because if we have disempowering speech flowing out of who we are, I'd say almost always there's a clog somewhere in our hearts and our minds due to the experiences that we've had, maybe the decisions that we've made, whatever it might be, that we need to be able to look inward and say, okay, does the filter need to be unclogged a little bit here? Does something need to be cleaned out within my soul so that my talk can start to represent who I want to be as a person, how I want to treat other people, the kind of grace that I want to carry as a follower of Jesus, the kind of love that I want to have for others? Or is my speech and the way that I talk holding me back from all of those things? Is it creating an invisible ceiling on our lives? And I believe a lot of the time it can be. So here's a couple of things that I want to finish with here this morning. And I'm going to invite the team to come and join us, and they're going to lead us through one more awesome song of worship as we finish today. But as we think of what it means to be a follower of Jesus and have an experience of life that kind of matches how God sees who we are, I actually think our language is a really great part of who we are just to focus in on. Because we've kind of already built this idea that our speech will reflect what's happening internally. But I also think that our speech can begin to renew what's happening internally. So it doesn't just have to reflect what's going on in here, but it can actually be a tool to renew what's going on in here. And the first step of that, the first part of that whole process, is getting a clear picture of where we're at. Because like I said before, we learn how to speak, we start speaking, and we never really think or reflect on the kind of speech that's coming out of who we are. So here's what I want to invite you to do this week. This is super practical. I believe that the Word of God should always show up in really practical ways in our lives. That when Jesus says, out of the goodness of your heart will flow goodness in your speech. The Apostle Paul, in another part of Ephesians 4:29, says, let no unwholesome talk come out of your mouth, but only that which is uplifting for others. You know, that's for us as well. Talk that builds us up and builds others up. And in that way, our speech can actually renew rather than reflect things that need to change within our hearts. So here's what I want to invite you to do this week, is open your ears to disempowering language in yourself. Again, super easy to do with other people. That's a couple of steps down the line. We're gonna do this for ourselves. To actually hear when something comes out of us, it's like, oh my goodness, this is too hard. I don't have what I need to get this done. This is ridiculous. Man, I'm not right for this. I'm not good enough for this. Whether it's God, you've got it wrong, or someone else in your world, you've got it wrong. You're seeing something in me that's not there. You know, this week, my prayer is you start to hear those phrases and you start to take hold of them. And then you'd start to bring new language. When something feels hard, when something feels difficult, when you feel like you've been let down by someone else, how can your language begin to renew what's going on in your heart? It could be thinking about a problem. Rather than a problem and a challenge, it's an opportunity to grow. It could be pain that you've experienced. Again, it's an opportunity to become a person that can handle that. So I want you to reflect on your language this week. Maybe you could even journal. I've actually done this before in my own life and written down some phrases that I've used. And it's amazing when you switch your brain onto this, you'll start to hear it coming out of your mouth. I still do it all the time. Really awesome thing to do as a parent. Journal those phrases that don't come out quite right. Own them. So how can this be renewed in who I am? What's an empowering phrase I could use instead? to make a difference in the life of my children, my workplace, wherever you find yourself. Let's be mindful of what's coming out of who we are. And let's use it to renew what's going on in here. And of course, the trump card that each of us have as followers of Jesus, we can invite the Holy Spirit into this whole equation as well. We don't just need to work on something practical. We say, Holy Spirit, would you renew this within me? Can I be, Jesus, transformed by the renewing of my mind, as Paul says in Romans? Can there be a renewal in me by your Spirit, Lord? Can we stand together? We're going to sing this song, and I'd love to just pray. I'd love to pray a prayer of blessing over you, over your household, over your workplace, over the relationships in your life, and that your speech would build others up, that your speech would build yourself up. Let me pray. God, I thank you for every person here this morning. God, I want to thank you that you've given each of them a voice that has value, a voice that matters, a voice that is powerful, a voice that can transform their world. And Jesus, by your Holy Spirit, I pray you would do a renewing work in each of our minds and our souls. Holy Spirit, would you help us to unclog those filters in our life, the encoding and decoding that's going on in our minds and hearts. Jesus, would they be shaped by the fruits of your Spirit as our kids are learning today? Jesus, would you do a renewing work within us? God, open our ears up to the phrases that keep us small. And God, empower us with words that keep us growing bigger and keep others growing bigger. Jesus, I ask that you be present in every person's life this week. God, I pray that you would do a new thing. And Jesus, as we sing this song together, I ask that the words would bring power to who we are, to our souls. Bring strength to our souls and model for us what it means to speak out the goodness of who you've created us to be. We praise you, God. Let's worship him together.